Remember that removable lower cross member I made a few videos ago? Time to cut a massive notch out of it. Removing material from these sections means I can get the radiator in position and check my clearances. As you can see, it's very tight at the back. The oil filter housing by itself is very close to the radiator surface. With a filter installed, it just doesn't fit at all. My solution? More parts, of course. This is an oil filter relocation kit from Micra. The kit includes a takeoff plate which attaches in place of the oil filter, and a remote filter head that can be positioned anywhere that makes sense. Both parts are connected with this braided hose and AN hardware. I'm going to cover the detailed installation of this in its own video because I think it will benefit people with these engines that aren't bothered about the whole project. But with this installed, the entire assembly will protrude a fraction of what it does now, so it's worth it. It also means I could bypass the factory oil cooler and add my own cooler in series with the remote filter kit. That removes some coolant lines from the front of the engine and brings the connection to the loop backwards for better pipe routing from the radiator, so it's a pretty essential part of the conversion. Someone commented in one of my previous videos that the vertical position of the radiator would mean that the fill cap isn't the highest point in the system, which in turn could mean trapped air potentially in the cylinder head, which would be bad. Looking at the engine bay, it's obvious that the cap isn't higher than the top of the engine, but it doesn't have to be. Here's the fill cap on my Civic, clearly positioned below the topmost point of the engine. Looking at the side of the head, there's a large coolant passage that's definitely lower than the cap, but I don't like to make assumptions, so to reassure us all, I decided to take off the valve cover so that I could try and see any evidence of coolant passages in the upper portion of the head. Okay, so if I remove these covers, I think these are like windage trays or windage things. I don't know why, they're not even bolted down, they just lift off. They probably help with like oil control or something. Don't actually know. So the highest cam is the intake cam. Interesting thing about these engines is that despite being a belt drive, the belt only controls the exhaust cam. It goes all the way to the end, and then there's a chain that controls the intake cam. So it's kind of like it's a chain and belt driven engine, which is, I don't know how common that is, but I've not seen that before. What I'm looking for here is just any evidence of any like coolant passages that are higher than a certain point, and I don't really think there are any. So you can't see me at the moment, but I'm just eyeballing where the top of the head is and comparing that with where the top of the radiator cap is. From what I can gather, there is actually nothing in here that is higher than the radiator cap. So I think we are good. I think it's fine. Actually, whilst looking in here, it's not too bad. It's a little bit brown, a little bit varnished, but it's not sludgy or anything like that. I can't see anything in there that's really giving me any cause for concerns. It's definitely a leak in the cam cover gasket, but we knew that anyway because the spark plugs were full of oil. Just to illustrate my point a little bit better, if you look inside of here, it's mostly empty space, right, because the cams are occupying all of this, and then you've got like nothing, right? So realistically, the top of the head, or anywhere where there's going to be any coolant passages, is going to be underneath there, if anything. Now that equates to, I would say, can you just see that sort of bright bit there where my finger is kind of tracking? That is kind of that point on the outside. So our radiator cap is actually higher than that. I really can't show it on camera because there's just too much stuff in the way, but yeah, there's no cause for concern there. To anyone who was concerned about that, I hope that makes you feel a bit better. Let's take a break, shall we? Sorry. What you're looking at here are the stock K11 micro brakes. As you can see, they are just your standard single piston sliding caliper, which is in of itself absolutely fine. The problem is this. We have here is a solid brake rotor or disc, and the problem with these isn't so much their size, it's the fact that they are solid. Even under like sort of stock power, if you were to take a Micra on a track, these are going to fail pretty fast. Not because they're not big enough to handle the car, they're more than adequately sized. It's just that they're just going to fade really fast because these get massively hot, they can't dispel the heat properly, and then they just stop working. So I can't just put a vented disc because the calipers are not designed for a vented disc, they're designed for a solid disc like this one. I had a dig around in my box of spare parts and found these. These are front brakes from a P11 Primera GT. This Primera GT to be exact. If these fit, then I'd save myself some money, but sadly they don't. The bolt spacing for the carrier is narrower than it is on the Micra. 100mm on the Primera versus 130mm on the Micra. Any money spent on making them fit is better spent on a set of these. So these ones are a set of AD22VF front brakes. You can actually find these on a bunch of cars, including Almira GTI with the 2-litre SR20. You can find them on Pulsar GTiRs, which I think is what these came from. You can also find them on the 100NX, at least the one with the SR20. I think the 1.6 came with slightly different brakes. I think they came with AD18s. Can't remember exactly. Anyway, so the centre's there, 130mm, just like the stock Micra ones. So these will actually just directly bolt on. However, the offset is slightly different. So you actually have to use some washers, which seems like a bodge fix, but there's already washers here. So anyway, basically you put them between the carrier and the hub, and it just backs it off just a little bit so that when you put the disc on, it doesn't rub on one side of the disc, that's all. You could probably solve it by having a slightly different offset on the disc, but that means getting custom discs made. It's just easier to just spend pennies on washers instead. Show you the rotor that came with this. I say rotor singular because it only came with a single rotor. There's the size of the Micra one, and there's the size of the one from the Pulsar. Not massively different. It is obviously bigger, but not by a huge margin. Let's measure the diameter, 233mm-ish. These are 255. I guess if we're measuring in old style, these are 10 inches. So in terms of size, much bigger than these. However, the size of these rotors is definitely not an issue. Making these bigger is not going to be able to make me stop faster. However, they will allow me to stop for longer because these are vented. Air comes through there, the air just sort of whizzes outwards as the wheel turns, and that's going to allow them to cool down, which means these will work for a lot longer than these do. A set of AD18s I think are probably more suited for a car of the Micra size, even with a 180 in it. I think these are just going to lock up as soon as I hit the pedal, but we'll see. We can always change them out if we need to, and I mean, leaving the stock Micra brakes on is pretty much a no-go. Shall we test fit them to the car, see what they look like? This is a fairly well documented upgrade, so I didn't expect to run into any issues installing these. The 15-inch Almira GTI wheels also fit with no issues, also not surprising since these brakes were fitted to the same car. They are in desperate need of a refurb, which they will get, but the seals look okay and everything moves like it should, so they ought to be fine in the short term. All they'll need is new pads, and because I only have a single brake disc, I'll need to get a new set of those too. A shame, because aside from a lot of surface corrosion, this one I have is in good condition and doesn't look like it's seen that many miles. It turns out that the notch I removed from the lower cross member earlier was a bit aggressive, so I needed to add it back in at the right height. Each edge there. Now it fits nearly. With the lower radiator tabs tacked in place, I started work on the upper radiator support. Because this is just a prototype, I didn't record much of the work. Ultimately, this design ended up not working out because of issues with the radiator itself, but I decided to include it in the video anyway because I think it's beneficial sometimes to show how the prototyping process unfolds, whether it succeeds or fails. The problem is that nothing is lining up. And I've checked all of my measurements. Checked the distance between the edge of the cross member and the edge of the radiator at the bottom, and that's the same all along the length. Slightly wider on that edge than it is on this edge. This edge is actually perfect, but this edge is not. You can see where they just don't line up, whereas on this side, yeah, there's a bit of an overlap there, but they butt up against each other, so this return actually contacts the top of here, so I'll be able to weld that together. Everything has been made on the assumption that the radiator was square, and it's not. It's a rectangle. I'm not sure if these aftermarket aluminium radiators are always like that, and I think maybe what I'll have to do is just design in some adjustability, and then I can keep this all straight, and then the radiator can be as crooked or as warped as it wants within the boundaries of this, which has to be straight to the car. Otherwise the bonnet isn't going to close properly, and that's going to be a problem. Just don't weld galvanised steel like I did. Even if you think you've ground the coating off, there's always a bit left over. After tack welding the two sections together, all I needed to do was cut out the centre part, which would give me the clearance I need to reach the radiator cap and oil dipstick, whilst also allowing room for the charge pipe to the throttle body. Next up was the bonnet catch. In order to accurately match the position of the catch to the new part, I used a laser line aligned to the bolt holes on the original panel before swapping them over and marking on the new part. Yeah, so about there. I used a thicker piece of 2mm thick steel to mount the catch for additional strength. That extra thickness ended up pushing the assembly forwards a bit too much though, so that's where I left it. When I revisit this part, I use 2mm steel for the upper bracket and weld the studs directly to that instead. Changing direction once again, I need to liberate the map sensor from this plastic charge pipe. I just need the sensor, but the captive nuts encased in the pipe are spinning, so I had to take destructive measures to free the sensor. Was it worth the £40 for a brand new genuine Bosch sensor? No, probably not. The sensor will now live in this mounting tube from Forge Motorsport. There must be two different available sizes for these map sensors, so I had to use the included reducer plate. I'm sure this will need some sort of sealant to avoid a potential boost leak, but I've dry fitted it for now. Now to enjoy the benefits of all that work I did in the last video. With everything all labelled up, there's no second guessing which connector goes where. It really does pay to do your homework on this sort of thing because it could stop you from frying something. With the engine harness connected up, it's time to install the fuel lines. Because the Micra's hard lines emerge from the right hand side of the engine bay and the fuel rail barbs for this engine are on the left, I had to run both the feed and return lines across the top of the inlet manifold. It's not ideal, but as long as I leave enough hose so that it doesn't kink as it turns back on itself, there shouldn't be a problem. This chode screwdriver is pretty handy for getting into tight spaces like this fuel line clamp. Right, we've got everything all wired up and we've extended that wiring onto the bench that I've just brought close to the car. Got the ECU over here, got my spreadsheet over here. Power wise, we've got the power feed. The big fat cable is going straight to the starter motor and the thinner cable is making a bit of a trip down there, coming back up into this professional bit of work. And all this is doing is distributing 12 volts to the ECU through that. It's also connected to the alternator through this cable. It's also back powering the Micra's fuse box through this cable. What I've also done is just put this jump lead on a ground connection on one side of the loom, and the other side is just connected to the engine mount down here. The other side of this cable just goes to just a grounding bolt down there which connects everything else up to ground or earth. So connection wise everything's fine. What we've also done is connected up fuel line. This is the original fuel filter. Obviously not going to be running that long term, but this should be fine for the short term. For the fuel pump, again, we're just using the standard Micra one to start with. Should be more than enough to at least start the engine. It'll probably run it too, perfectly fine, but that will be upgraded in the future. Fuel pump relay is actually down here, but in order to get it to work, where is it? Yeah, we've just had to, there's a clamp there that's just connecting this pin, which would normally come from the ECU, to ground. So the ECU would normally ground that pin to tell the fuel pump to come on. We've just grounded it permanently for now. So the fuel pump works. We've also got the pedal attached over here. That's the plug that would normally be inside the car. Most of this wiring would be inside the car normally. But then we've got the pedal over here, so we can at least check that the pedal actually opens the throttle. We've also got the ECU here. Just ignore these labels, they're redundant. But that's all connected up to both sides of the harness and connected up to power and ground as well. So it's all looking a bit janky, but we'll at least be able to try and get the thing turning over, and then we can tidy it all up and put the proper connections in later on. My plan is to not have any of this small wiring inside the car at all. This will actually connect directly to the connection block that's in the corner by the footwell, and then it will power the Micra's fuse box directly rather than having to come back out through this mess and then back in again. We have a laptop running VCDS connected to the OBD port so that we can check for readings for the sensors we've connected and find any potential problems. We can set up the software to display measuring blocks that contain useful data such as crank speed or throttle position. Just need to add some of Tesco's finest petrol and we can give it a test. I'm using Tesco Momentum rather than their normal unleaded fuel because the Micra is definitely not cleared for E10. And because the Audi TT donor was from early 2003, it's a bit close, so better to be safe than sorry. Now for the moment of truth. Again? Yeah. Alright, well that was a letdown. Luckily we can scan for error codes to see if there's anything obvious that might be stopping the engine from starting before we start pulling things apart. All of the codes highlight things that we already knew about, except for these two codes for the wastegate and camshaft position actuators, which were definitely plugged in but basically reporting missing. We tried a few more times, checking readings to ensure the engine timing wasn't an issue, but nothing seemed to point to a reason for a non-start. I ended up running out of time, so came back the next day to continue troubleshooting by myself. Alright, so as you saw from some of that footage, the engine would turn over fine, but we already knew that. So because it won't start, I think before we start looking into the wiring side of it, because that is quite a bit of a can of worms to open, we'll just check the basics, which is, you know, your usual spark, fuel. It could just be that it's not timed properly, or because this isn't reading correctly. I don't know, it could be lots of things, but we'll try the basics first. Oh, and because I know some people probably mention it, there are a few things that aren't plugged in. For example, we've got the map sensor down here, that's not plugged in. The MAF sensor is plugged in. Neither of the O2 sensors are plugged in because I just don't have them. The oil, temperature and level sender isn't plugged in. I don't believe those are necessary for the engine to work, but what is plugged in are both knock sensors, both timing sensors, so the crank and cam position sensors, and the actuator. All of the coil packs and all of the injectors are plugged in. So after a little bit of research, I found out that with these connectors, the way you are actually supposed to undo them is you're supposed to push the connector in, like squeeze it in, then push this tab down, and then it should come out. And that does work, but that absolutely kills your thumbs and your fingers. So up here it's nice and easy, but I don't know how they expect you to do that for something like down under the manifold like the knock sensors. If you were trying to do that with your thumbs, you'd have to have steel thumbs to be able to do that. So yeah, the screwdriver method is probably going to break these long term. Some of these are already broken. Okay, spark plug out. It's a bit wet, but that's probably because we've been trying to crank it, and that's probably fuel. It could also be oil actually. Yeah, it's a bit oily. It's probably oil getting in through the seals. There we go. So if I just rest that on there, that should ground the spark plug, and we should be able to see whether it sparks or not. Not sure if you can hear that high pitch noise, but that's the throttle body just doing its calibration. So I've connected power, and I've also disconnected the fuel pump relay negative so that it's not going to try and pump fuel in the system whilst I'm cranking this. Let's try and crank it, see if we get any spark. No, there's just no spark there at all, is there? Okay, so no spark, that's certainly not going to help. Now, the next question is, why isn't it sparking? Is it because there's just a bad ground somewhere? Now, I know that the engine is grounded properly, but is the rest of the harness grounded properly? Is there a missing ground somewhere in here? So that's what I need to find out next. Or is it just because the ECU is not firing this coil, or any of the coils, because something else isn't happy? Now, I have to admit that I had a bit of a silly moment with this. During all the excitement the previous day, I must have misremembered what the fault codes had read. It clearly says here that the camshaft timing adjustment has an open loop, but I must have gotten it into my head that the crankshaft position sensor was the problem. That led me on a complete wild goose chase, checking the wiring to the crank sensor, pulling it from the block entirely to inspect it for signs of damage, probably damaging it in the process. My logic was that if the ECU didn't see a timing signal, then it might not send a pulse signal to the ignition coils. But even when I measured the ignition pulse pin and saw that it was actually getting a signal, it still didn't occur to me that this wasn't the issue. As I was beginning to get frustrated at the rat's nest of wires spewing out the front of the engine bay, I decided to turn off the camera, pull that entire second half of the harness off the car and reorganise it so that it was a little easier to manage, and that was when I found the problem. Those who watched my last video where I went through all the connectors and wiring may remember this T14A connector that connects both of the ECU harnesses together. It contains a few connections that link some of the sensors on the main engine harness, but on pin 7 is this thick brown cable which I had noted in my spreadsheet should earth somewhere, but I never attached it to anything. Why didn't anyone warn me?
Do you know what a lot of this could be? Bad earth.
Is it because there's just a bad ground somewhere? Is there a missing ground somewhere in here? Also on this connector, on pin 6, is a yellow-black wire that sends a 12-volt ignition live to various actuators on the engine, including the N75 wastegate solenoid, the N249 recirculation solenoid, and the N205 camshaft position actuator. Or at least it would if I'd actually connected it to the 12-volt ignition live. The whole time both were disconnected, and once I'd earthed the brown wire, the ignition coil started working and I was finally getting a spark. I still haven't connected that ignition live for those actuators, but once I do, then I'm almost certain those codes will disappear. So there's your two-part lesson in documentation. First part, write documentation. Second part, read your documentation. Okay, coil packs are back in, injectors are plugged in. All this clamp is doing is just making sure I've definitely got a good ground from the valve cover to the head, so the other side is connected to the head. I'm just going to reconnect that ground from the fuel pump relay as well. Okay. Right, ready? Okay, the problem is that when I turn the key off, the engine still runs. That engine not turning off on the key problem is probably because I've somehow given the ECU a permanent 12-volt supply from the battery instead of switched ignition. I'll need to have a look at how I've wired up the relay in order to fix that. So the engine runs. It runs terribly, but it runs. Keep in mind that it's missing a bunch of sensors. There's no exhaust, the turbo isn't even connected to the intake manifold, and the whole engine kicks violently because there's no dog bone mount installed. I wish I could run it a bit longer, but because there's no cooling, I can only run it for a few seconds at a time. But in the next parts, I'll be tidying up all of this wiring so that it goes inside the car, not sprawled across my improvised workbench, and I'll hopefully have a cooling solution in place so we can keep it running for more than a few seconds. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed sharing this milestone with me. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I hope you'll come back for the next one.